welcome everybody to another edition, finally, of the Psych Monologues. And yes, I'm Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host. I am still alive after almost a 2-month hiatus, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. It's been an interesting summer, to say the least. As you can no doubt tell, I haven't shared a live broadcast or podcast here for quite some time. And there's lots of good reasons for that are ultimately a part of even what we're talking about here. If you'll notice, the title for the podcast today is called Farewell to the Shadowlands. And I'm not real sure how this is going to go. Let me back up and introduce and all that kind of stuff that I typically do at the beginning, just to get us out of the gate here a little bit. If you're wondering, and you've just tuned in because this popped up on your feed, the Psych Monologues is a podcast exploring the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. I am not setting out to necessarily on a series of coherent, connected topics. The way that I'm going about doing this in a lot of ways is the things that God presses on my heart at a given time. And I hope and maybe even assume that God moves my heart in such a way that I start talking about things that are meaningful to you, my listeners. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax. I want to kind of set before you an issue that has been weighing on my heart all summer. Hopefully that matters to you as well. I think sooner or later it probably will. So we want to talk about the things about where you live, what you think, how you feel about living life with others in Jesus and even with yourself. So getting back to why such a long hiatus, I know that probably is a death knell to most podcasts, that if they go silent for so long, sooner or later people just fade away and not really care. And for that, I wouldn't blame anyone, really. But one of the things that has been playing in my mind as I've thought about getting back to this, it has been fairly difficult. But one of the constants of our spiritual journey is loss and the accompanying grief that goes along with it. Oftentimes the phrase is used, everyone grieves, but not everyone mourns. And, when you think about it, there probably isn't any day that goes by in our lives where we experience loss. Now, in a lot of cases, people, when they think of that, they think of big things like somebody dying. But loss of expectations or hopes or other things like that, maybe even things as trite as a lunch date or a meeting that you had with somebody doesn't quite go the way you expected it to or hoped it would. And I don't say that really when I say that I'm kind of universalizing loss. But it is a part of our lives. We live with it all the time. We actually live with it in the background of our lives on a regular basis. We just don't pay attention to it. As a matter of fact, in some ways, we see loss as an interruption of the way life is supposed to be, rather than it being fundamentally woven into a part of who we are. So we tend to see a loss of some sort, whatever that might be, as there's something wrong. And when we forget about the fact that it's really always there. So when loss occurs, and remember, this can be a lot of different things: a loss of income, a loss of a friendship, people drifting away from one another, loss of expectations or hopes, all of it is a loss. And we can even experience a loss around things that are bad, that we don't like. Because sometimes it gets so embedded in our lives and we just acclimate to it and adapt to it. And then when it goes away or ceases to be there, we experience a loss. We have to adjust. We have to make change. I mean, in some ways of thinking about it, any change in our lives oftentimes reflect a loss. So that doesn't mean we go through a full-blown process of mourning for any of these. Maybe some of them, loss of a job or income, but they have an impact on us, and we really don't pay much attention to it because it's so common. Now, there are certain losses, certainly, that jump out at us and get our attention. Like, for example, the death of a loved one. And that has what has cast a shadow across my entire summer. Now, somebody asks me, so how was your summer? And I really struggle to know how to answer that. Because in some respects, if I'm being honest, that shadow is so profound that all the other things that I would normally be saying, hey, it's been a great summer. We got to go to Grand Lake. We did some camping. We did a variety of activities with family and friends and things like that. It was all good, I think. But then there's a shadow. And that shadow was cast in pretty much more or less most of July. And what I wanted to do in trying to talk my way through this, now, don't think that if you've never listened to psych monologues before, don't think this is, Dr. Mitch's self-therapy. But I think there is something to be said for self-reflection. And it's gotten me thinking because this podcast has been playing over in my mind for quite some time, really. And what I want to do is go somewhere that is a favorite of mine in a book, a story, and it's going to provide with some context about the other stuff that I want to fill you in on. And I know there are a lot of people that listen to this podcast that know me well and know a little bit of my story. There's a lot that it has unfolded even as I've done the podcast. But the story comes from the Chronicles of Narnia, and it is in the last battle. As a matter of fact, it's the last two paragraphs of the last battle. And in the last chapter, we find that the children think that they're in the midst of a railway accident, and then suddenly they find themselves in this country where they can run forever and they can run up waterfalls and they can do all sorts of crazy things, and they see lots of people and animals that they knew and were familiar with. And restored relationships occur, and finally they get to the very end, and lo and behold, there's Aslan waiting for them. And if you're not familiar with the story of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan is the main character, and he is always kind of lurking in the background in a lot of ways, and I think clearly we would say that he is the picture that C.S. Lewis uses in the Chronicles as a picture of Jesus. And so as they approach him, he makes a comment to him saying, "You don't look as happy as I would mean you to be." And Lucy, who's always the talkative one, says, "Yeah, well, we're just afraid of being sent away again." And he looks at her kindly and says, "I guess you haven't guessed." And he says, there was a railway accident, said Aslan softly. Your father and mother and all of you, as you used to call it in the shadowlands, are dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream has ended. And this is morning. So why do I read that? And it has everything to do with the title of this particular episode, and that is Farewell to the Shadowlands. This summer has been filled with lots of joy and happiness, as I mentioned earlier, with my family and my grandsons, and walks and conversations and recovering from a school year. It's been good, but there's been a shadow. And that really was truly the sweet part of it. But there was a bitter part of it. And that occurred in the month of July. It was during July that my father-in-law, Dr. Paul Williams, said goodbye to the Shadowlands. And it was profoundly bittersweet. He had been a part of my life for over 50 years. Now, a lot of people usually guess wrongly how old I am. But it's over half a century. There's no small measure of memories that go with over 50 years. And he was no small part or player, really, in the story of my life. Not the least of which is when I actually joined his family by marrying his youngest daughter. But he and his family provided a sanctuary for me when my mom had headed off to Chicago to be with my dad when he died. And she came back, and I was there in their home when my mom came back to tell me that my dad had also left the Shadowlands. And Paul was an interesting guy. He was smart. He certainly provided me a model for professional demeanor, working in the professional world. His world was the world of animals. He was a veterinarian for over 30 years. And for me, it was the world of counseling and psychology and therapy. But he showed me what a professional was like, and how you handle yourself, and also how you handle relationships with people. And if you've ever read my book, Grieving the Loss of Someone You Love, you'll notice in the introduction, there's the story that after I had married into their family, and Paul oftentimes needed to have an extra hand when he did an emergency call. And in this particular case, he said, "Hey, you want to go with me? I could use an extra hand." And I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And we got there, and his family brought in a poor, broken, mangled body of a little dog that had gotten run over and hit by a car. And Paul did an exam and looked closely, and clearly the little one was not going to make it. And he broke the news to the family, and he said, "Why don't you take your time, say your goodbyes?" And then he took the little dog back into the back area of the clinic, and he said, "Why don't you hold it?" And he gave it the injection that is usually used to euthanize animals. And I was stunned at the rapidity with which there was life, and then there wasn't life anymore. And we talked on the way home, and I said, "Paul, how do you do this? How do you do this with people that are so attached to their animals?" And he said, I've come to realize that it is very much a part. Death is every bit as much a part of life as life is. As a matter of fact, the joys and the memories and everything that they have had with that little dog now lives on in their hearts, even though the dog is not with them anymore. And there was a lot of wisdom there. It was unintentional wisdom. Most of the best wisdom oftentimes is. and he was that kind of wise. There was also this other side of him that was, you might call, curmudgeonly. Now, I often use that word of myself. There are times where it feels like I can be, that old man that yells at kids to get off his front lawn. But he was curmudgeonly. He had edges on him. And he was irritating and loyal to a fault. And so many times that he would pick up on a point of something. I was going through doctoral training, and I'd talk about something, and he was sure he had a better idea about psychology than I did, and we'd go at it. And now I look back on that and think, I don't know that I appreciated that very much. I was kind of getting full of myself and being a prospective doctor of psychology, and I didn't really like being questioned by a veterinarian. But at the same time, his pushing in was very much a indication and a passion of his love for me. That family very much adopted me. I consider myself thrice adopted. I was adopted as a kid, and I was adopted into that family as well, not only adopted into the family of God. So, but he was truly the poster child for someone who was a mixed bag. There were things about him that people really didn't like, and to some degree you could understand it, and at the same time also say, he could be certainly very blind in terms of social cues and things like that. But the one thing he had going for him was the love and the loyalty to his family, and that was something that I learned in my relationship with him. And in a lot of ways, he was the father I never had, and he had this power of affirmation at his fingertips, and particularly in my life. And last November, Lynn and I went to visit him one last time, and we knew that it was probably going to be a goodbye. And you probably heard me before on this podcast and other places talk about the importance of goodbyes. And I was put to the test during that time. Was I going to make it a good goodbye or not? And as we were leaving, and I think looking back on it, I did an adequate job. I don't think I did it enough. Partly because he was kind of in and out and very sleepy. And the one thing that would wake him up is an Ohio State football game. And so I had his attention during that time, which we shared. But as we were leaving, he said something to me that would live with me. And I'm not, that's not for me to say here because it's between me and him. But it would live with me for the rest of my life. Actually, in a lot of ways, it cast a positive shadow, if you will, into the future of the kind of person I want to be. But it was the significance of it was the last thing he would say to me here in the shadowlands. And that's what I want to kind of place before you today is there's a very much a part of our spiritual journey that has the stuff that we really, really like and love. And in another podcast, I spent a little time talking about our propensity for being addicted to happiness. And so when anything negative happens or sad happens or things like that, we say, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want, I don't want to create such a shadow. And yet there's so much about the biblical story, even the story of Israel and the story even of Jesus' life, that is punctuated by sorrow. And to some degree, the deeper the sorrow, the more profoundly we can experience the joy. And we forget about, and I'll give you this example. And it occurred to me today, even as I'm bracing myself for impact with the semester. It's going to be starting up here real soon. And I went out, and my daughter was underneath our tree, swinging in the swing, a little girl that she does childcare for. And I was standing in the living room looking out at them, and it occurred to me that here she was engaging in joy and life and everything under the shadow of this tree. This tree is huge. It just dominates our front yard. And because we have a 5-month-old grandson, we set up a little swing out there to keep him busy as well as give us some relief at times. And they were a microcosm of what we are here. We forget about the fact that we live in the shadowlands, that the things that we experience here are only a shadow of the things to come. And yet we conduct life with joy and engagement and relationship and connection and everything under that shadow. We don't know anything else, but it's still a shadow. And when you walk out of the shadow of the tree, you're almost blinded by the sunlight. And that is what I think Paul experienced as he said goodbye to the shadowlands. He went from what was a shadow of what things were to what they really were, and all the people that would be waiting for him. The guy lived 95 years. As the old saying goes, he used all the runway. So when I get down to this and start out this kind of season, if you will, or I suppose we're entering our third season with the psych monologues. I don't know that there's a punchline per se. It's just random reflections about saying goodbye to the shadowlands and living in the shadowlands to the fullest extent that we can. But there isn't a punchline. The words of Ecclesiastes rings in my ears that I think is so much more, is wisdom that's so much more profound than anything I can provide. But it's a verse that I think is oftentimes not really attended to or noticed, really. I mean, when you think of Ecclesiastes, a lot of times people will say, yeah, that's a real bummer of a book in the Bible. I don't know why they put it in there. It's just vanity and vanities, all this shadow and vapor, and it's all not worth pursuing. But the teacher says in Ecclesiastes, he says it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. And this is what really caught my attention. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. We shy away from the shadows of the valley And when we do, we oftentimes suffer to experience the highs of the mountaintops, because we're lopping off the depths of what we are experiencing and what life is. Life is built on contrasts. And without those contrasts, it doesn't have any depth. It's just flat. Oh, well, maybe mountaintops and flat. And the thing the other thing that just occurs to me, even as I'm talking about this, is I wonder what kind of people we are. Are we the kind of people that are willing to be valley people who can connect with other people that are also in the valley, who expected to be living on the plains or on the mountains rather than in the valleys? Because people of valley people, if you will, are deep people. And quite honestly, between you, me, and the hedge post fence, I think we need more of deep people. We've got more than enough of the shallow celebrity of social media stuff going on. We get drawn into the belief that life is out there rather than here. And here oftentimes has us in the valley. And the people that are willing to walk with us there without providing us with solutions and platitudes and God's got a plan for your life. And while that is true, that's not what I need to hear when I'm in the valley. What I need to hear is, let's walk. I'll walk with you. And that's very much a part of that. So needless to say, and I don't know what your summer's been like. It's probably been punctuated by a variety of changes and other things, some good, some not so good. And we're quick to really dismiss the not so good parts. And it may not be at the time, where we are, where I'm at even now, where it can only be processed a little at a time. It can't be processed all at once. In a lot of cases, most people think uniformly that denial is a bad thing. But when you're going through grieving, when you're going through mourning, denial is actually a blessing, because it provides us with a space to just be okay, because we long to be okay. We long to be okay, as if okay is not being in pain, not having sorrow, and that's not the shadowlands. That may be the real lands where we're heading, but that's not the shadowlands. So, like I said, I don't have a punchline. I don't have necessarily a challenge. I hope just some of these reflections get you thinking about, we're heading into the fall. We're heading into a new season. Kids are going back to school. And there are a variety of things that come our way between now and, August 2023 that will come our way. And the challenge, of course, is if we're going to live in the valley, to not shut our hearts off in the valley, but allowing them to be known and connected with. And that's hard. That's really hard. I can tell you that there are days that I'd just rather just be alone and not talk at all. But then I have a podcast to do, and it kind of forces me to talk, and so you end up getting a stream of consciousness out of me that perhaps I would hope would be encouraging, but also just get you reflecting a little bit on the true meanings of your relationships and your connections with people and how you do them, and what kind of person are you in terms of a valley person or a mountaintop person, and how adaptable can we be between those two things. I mean, Paul talks about it a lot, of grieving with those who are in grief, experiencing grief, and delighting and rejoicing for those people that are rejoicing. He's talking about being adaptable. So, needless to say, you may say, well, that's a bummer message to start the live series out with, but I have been reminded again of two very profound realities. One is I am still living in the shadowlands, and in a lot of cases, the expectations and hopes and dreams and everything I have are still in the shadowlands, and the fire that triggers those hopes and dreams and things like that has actually a real anchor point that will be fulfilled in a lot of ways when I finally get to walk out of the shadowlands and into the sunlight, where everything is clear and everything is real. This is no less real because this is all the real I know. But it is something that allows us to reflect and maybe review about the nature of the relationships we have and how we do them, and even how we do that with ourselves. Because needless to say, there's a fair amount of our grieving, and I can tell you this, I can affirm this for you, even after going into a season of grief that I'm in, is people expect you to get over it. They do. It's not any fault of anyone, but it's really inconvenient when you have an interaction with somebody. And I had this happen at school. I was there at school a couple weeks ago. Somebody said, "How was your summer?" And I said, "It was crappy." And they didn't know what to say. The person didn't know what to say. It was like he was all prepared to say, "Oh, great, yeah, I had a great summer too." And I just threw a monkey wrench into that, or just did whatever to it. And finally, he got himself reoriented. He said, I really appreciate your honesty, because that's all we can really offer one another. It requires our own honesty with ourselves. So anyway, farewell to the Shadowlands, and those who get to say farewell. It's a bittersweet reality of sending them off into that place, but also to have the memories and the things that are left behind, the fingerprints that are left behind on us from their life and their interactions with us, for good or for ill, and to allow that to be leveraged into, as Solomon said, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. It prompts us to reflect. That's how sorrow can be better than laughter, because it prompts us to think and to reflect and to think about the decisions that we have to make into the future. So, food for thought. Like I said, it's kind of a profound subject to jump into for the first time, the first episode back on live, but there's more to come. There's a lot more to come. And so we are heading into the next season with the psych monologues. If you have questions or anything at all that come out as a result of some of what I had to say tonight, feel free to direct message me on Instagram. And if you want to subscribe to all the various content and things that comes from me and from my books and other things that I'm doing, you can subscribe and follow us on the website at drmitch.com. Or on Instagram, you can follow us there as well at the Psych Monologues. Facebook, Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn, drmitch, M-I-T-S-C-H, if you've never heard me be specific about spelling my last name. If for the podcast, I'd encourage you to subscribe to us on Spotify or Stitcher or iTunes or whatever podcast content provider you use. Amazon, iHeartRadio. We're on all of them. We can usually be found on any of them. And increasingly, the website will continue to develop over time. It's suffered from some benign neglect on my part because of what I just explained. So the other thing is that if you're interested in partnering with us to continue to grow the scholarship fund, we've got a little bit of a pivot for the scholarship fund now, because CCU has been generous enough to step up and begin to fund that for our active students. But there's no less the need for alumni of CCU and even other universities. If you know somebody that might be interested in one of our silent retreats, then point them our direction and at drmitsch.com and find out more about it. And perhaps we can include them if there's space. We could include them into our silent retreat. So this fund, the scholarship fund, is for our alumni. Now, if you think about it, during the time that you're going through school, if you went through higher ed, when you got out, you were not only a poor, broke college student, but now you are a poor, broke graduate. And there's still the need to engage the spiritual journey as we're doing and as we're introducing people to in silence and solitude. So this fund is for postgraduates, and we are very much in need of your tax-deductible gifts for the CCU silent retreats to make it possible for students to continue this as part of their ongoing efforts to grow and develop intimacy with Jesus. So if you do give a gift and decide to partner with us, it is tax deductible. If you want to do that on the website, you can do that at the bottom of the front homepage. There's a donation button. You can do that there. If you would like to contribute through a check, you can certainly do that as well. Just make your checks out to 1615.tv. And use that as the same address at P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado 80104. There are some major developments that have been slowly but surely building over the course of the summer, and I look forward to announcing those before too long. I think you all will be excited to hear what the potential plans are for the future in terms of not only the psych monologues, but other things that I am doing, and that I want to try to pass that along to other leaders who can also do that as well. So that's pending in the future. If you listened to the last episode and probably forgot it, but I'll mention it anyway. I had mentioned then that I was going to do an interview, and I still have that in the back of my mind to get done. I think you'll enjoy it, but I will get it scheduled and completed here before too long to fill in that particular promise that I made, so that we can be sure to allow to hear some other voices, not just mine, on this podcast. So I think that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for taking the time out to throw 35 minutes or so of your time, precious time, to my way, so we can discuss and look at the various elements that are very much a part of our spiritual journey with Jesus. So, as always, love you. Later.